Thank you. It's always difficult to be after such great speakers who say a lot of the things you have in your notes, and also after lunch. So I'm going to try and be a little bit provocative. So the first thing I'm going to say is I'm very happy to be in Norway in December. I think it's the best place in the world. I mean, who would want to be in South Africa right now? So we heard a lot about the equality agenda, the development agenda, but at the end of the day, if we don't have peace, equality and development are destroyed. Okay, and this is, I think, at the crux of where we are right now. Last year, the world spent $9.8 trillion, $9.8 trillion trying to contain violence. Okay, that's 11.3% of global GDP. And it was up from the year before. And I imagine this year it's going to be more of that, right? Which is money that should be going towards development. So instead of trying to engage in war and crises and so forth, which is where we are, we're taking away from actual development issues. And the question of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, it's been 15 years. I think most of you in this room are familiar with what this agenda is about, but I wanted to sort of put it in context of where we are now, why it still matters, and then what it is that we can be doing. And I was asked a couple of questions in preparation for this presentation. The first question I was asked was, what do we do to secure women's protection in war and post-war and ensure participation in just and sustainable peace? And the answer, in some ways, is very simple. The first thing we have to be doing is actually preventing wars, right? And stopping the ones that are happening. Because it's during war that we see tremendous de-development, tremendous backlash against women, attacks on women, attacks on people, frankly. I mean, one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that when we talk about the impact of war on women, it's the men who are dying. 90% of people who died in Iraq are men, in Syria, etc. Women are being left to pick up the pieces. There's a totally different experience of war between men and women. But we must recognize that there's this incredible human tragedy. And this agenda, one of the things that the Women, Peace and Security agenda did was to bring the human face of war into the spaces, into the Security Council, where very often that humanity doesn't exist. It's about states and interests and so forth. We've brought the human face of war into that space, and that's a really important development. So, number one, we should be preventing wars. Number two, if we're talking about protection in the context of wars, the first thing we have to do is we have to acknowledge that women are there, right? I was in Erbil recently in a displacement camp. And like every other refugee and displacement camp, you see a lot of women, you see a lot of kids, you see the women lugging barrels of water this big while the men are sitting under the shade doing nothing. I don't know why they're not carrying the water. I mean, you would think that carrying heavy things would be a sort of masculine endeavor, but they're not. And the question that I often ask when I'm in these settings is, as part of the humanitarian assistance that we're providing, are sanitary pads standard, right? We know women need them, right? It's a fact of life, right? So we know food is needed, we know shelter is needed. But 30 years on, or however many years on in terms of the refugee crises, these kinds of basic necessities are not part of the aid that we provide, right? And all you have to do is ask women. Ask women, what do they need? Ask women, what are they doing? Every time I see a photograph or an image of a woman in a refugee camp, whether it's in Chad or in Iraq or elsewhere, and it's always, sitting there looking sad and hanging onto a baby and so forth. For me, the two questions come to mind. Number one, how is she coping and how is she feeding her kids and making sure that they're safe, because that's what she's doing. Number two, what would I do if I were in that situation? In fact, what would any of us do, right? And all of a sudden you realize how incredibly courageous people are in those contexts and how active they are. They're not passive victims. They know exactly what they need. They know exactly what should be happening. And we don't talk to them. We don't include them in the planning and management and so forth. And this should just be basic, right? So those are just two of the things that we should be doing, and it's still not happening. Now, the third thing, I was involved in the mobilization and drafting of 1325 from the standpoint of civil society. And for me, what was and continues to be the reason why I do this work, and I'm motivated by it, is because everywhere I go, I meet women who have stood up. When war has come to their doorsteps, it doesn't matter what walk of life they come from, whether they're educated and elite or whether they're from the grassroots. It's women who have had the courage to say no to war and stand up and say, we don't want this. And it takes a lot of guts, right? When you have guns and when you have violence and when your own community is polarized, to stand up and say, actually, no, I'm going to talk to the other side. I'm going to try and do something different. I'm going to try and end this war. So that level of courage and commitment to me is something that we should be celebrating. And it is the essence and spirit of this agenda 15 years on. And yet, it's the one thing that we take for granted. In fact, if you look throughout the history of women's activism, their peace activism is always taken for granted. And it's interesting to be here today, one day before the Nobel Peace Prize is being awarded, because the person who was the inspiration for the Nobel Peace Prize was a woman called Bertha von Suttner. And she should be in all of our history books, right? It should be the Bertha von Suttner Peace Prize, in fact, because she was a pacifist and she inspired Alfred Nobel. And yet nobody knows who she is. Very, very few people know who this woman was. And if you look through the writings of women throughout history, they've always said the same things, and yet we don't acknowledge them. In South Africa, where are they? In Northern Ireland, where are they? They're always at the forefront of peace activism, and then when the war ends, they're sort of slightly marginalized and kind of erased out of history. And this is something that we have to recognize. And 1325 was really an attempt at bringing those voices back in. But where are we, and how have we made progress? There's one area where we've seen development. And for me, it's a little bit tinged with irony and sadness, because this year, on the 15th anniversary of this resolution, both Norway and the United States have said that women should have equal role in combat, right? They're going to be women, American women are now going to have the right to fight and the right to die and the right to kill alongside men, right? And if you take it from a gender equality angle, it makes perfect sense, right? Equality means equality in every sphere of life. Rights comes with responsibilities. So I get that. That part of it is important. But to claim that that is part of this agenda, I think is a problem. Because this agenda is about peace. And we really need to reclaim and value peace as opposed to taking it for granted, especially now. And here's the irony, that today they have the right to go off and fight and die and kill, but they still don't have the right to be at the peace table, to stop these wars, to prevent them. And that's where I think the focus of our attention should be. And I have to say, it's an arena where we don't need to talk about women's empowerment, to be honest with you, because the women I talk with and the women I'm dealing with are turbocharged in their empowerment. It takes a lot of self-empowerment to stand up in the middle of Iraq and say, enough, I'm going to stop what's going on, right? We don't need to empower these people. We just need to step aside and let them be in the spaces and places where decisions are being made. And that's what I'd like to see for the He for She campaign. Now, the other thing that's happening is that as we talk about progress, we can't pretend that there isn't active, planned backlash against the things that we're talking about, right? These social norms that are negative didn't come out of nowhere. They're coming out of certain places. And we have to recognize that these forces are very strong, very organized, very well funded, and they have an agenda. And at the moment, what I'm seeing in the realm that I'm working a lot with women in the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia, is that, of course, we're seeing the rise of extremism. We're seeing the rise of authoritarian states. We heard it from before that we're seeing the closure of civil society spaces in the name of anti-terrorism. So dissent is being linked to terrorism, and it's being shut down in many ways. We're seeing the rise of violence and the fragmentation of violence and the driving of the fear that's driving this and the kinds of issues that we're seeing. And to be honest with you, we're also being left dumbfounded. The San Bernardino attacks in California last week were by a young man and a young woman who left their baby in childcare before they went and killed 14 people. Okay, I mean, it's really hard to understand how that happens. And this is, when I talk about the regression, if you want, one of the things that we've seen over the last 100 years, since Bertha von Suttner was talking about these issues, is that 100 years ago, you didn't have women fighting. In the last 100 years, we've had women joining, liberation movements and armies, and now they are increasingly involved in terrorist activism as well. So women are becoming more violent, but where is the attention to peace? So we have this vicious negative cycle, more militarized responses, more bombs. This year alone, we're going to have 50 countries with a collective military budget of $1.6 trillion. Okay, $1.6 trillion going towards the military in 50 countries alone, at a time when the humanitarian aid crisis is becoming beyond scale. $20 billion, just, but again, look at the numbers. 1.6 trillion towards military, 20 billion for humanitarian assistance, and then guess where this money is coming from? It's from development aid. Right? Our development assistance is being slashed across the board, and not only from countries that give development assistance, but I think there has to be an onus and accountability on the countries where a lot of these problems are arising. Why is it that Pakistan has has 2% of its budget contributing towards education and over 17-18% going to military? The UAE has 48% of its budget going to the military, by the way. So it's this skewed notion of where our money is going. So it's a vicious negative cycle. And the danger in this is that while we leave a vacuum in education and health and so forth, and this has been going on really for about 30 years, somebody else is filling that gap. And guess who it is? It is those extremist forces. So when we're not providing education, ISIS is, right? When we're not providing health care, various militias, gangs, and so forth are. And with that comes their own ideology and indoctrination. In Syria and Iraq right now, what we're seeing is that in the areas where ISIS has taken over, they are using the schools to indoctrinate kids. So there's a whole generation of kids being fed with this information, and what's going to happen to them? The boys that they kidnap from the Yazidi communities have been indoctrinated to become fighters. What is Boko Haram doing? I mean, we have to understand that education and looking after refugees and being present in these communities is really part of the broader human security and security agenda, and it needs to be resourced. And there's a long-term implication for all this because, at the moment it feels as if we're going towards increased violence and war and so forth. But at some point this dust will settle, right? At some point the Syrian war will have to end. The Iraq conflict and Yemen and so forth will have to end. And we're going to need people there who are doctors and lawyers and engineers and social workers and teachers and civic actors and dancers and musicians to rebuild and reweave the social fabric. But people like that don't just come out of thin air, right? It's not like you have a baby today and then say, good luck to you, in 20 years' time you're going to be a lawyer and that's fine. Every day matters. Every day a child misses school, or every year the child misses school, it matters, right? And yet, this is what we are faced with. The absence of that sustaining that future for everybody, and it's also a place where civil society comes into place, because civil society emerges and appears in the absence of where the state can't provide these services. Civil society is, and they do it far more effectively. They are much cheaper in some ways, and yet, as Winnie mentioned earlier, it's the first ones to get their resources cut as well. So we have to think about where our priorities are. And remember what Einstein said. He said, we cannot simultaneously prevent war and prepare for it. And that's kind of the choice that we're facing right now. Now, in terms of the question of women at the peace table, if you want, or why it matters to have them there, here's what I wanted to share with you, right? So we always talk about the 1325 agenda as having the 4 Ps: prevention of conflict, protection of women, participation of women, and their participation in peacekeeping forces. But I want to offer you 3 other Ps right now. So why do we need people? Why do we need to widen the range of actors and to have women there? Number 1, because we have to recognize peace actors, because they have the guts and not the guns. Right? So it's one thing to have guns and get yourself there. It's another thing to have the guts and to do it without guns, to have a place there. And they have a creativity and a commitment to peace. I work with a woman in Iraq who is involved in demilitarizing militias, young men from militias. With $5,000, she manages to convince and talk to them. She's from their community. She knows how to talk to them. She knows how to engage them, and she gives them alternatives. She has these boys now cleaning schools, giving blood in hospitals, being clowns on Children's Day and so forth, doing theater work, right? $5,000. We work with a woman in Tajikistan. With between $300 and $400, she's running workshops to raise awareness. She also does de-radicalization. She works on de-radicalizing petty criminals who end up in jail and become radicalized as extremists in jail. One of the problems we have to look at is why is it that prisons under our very own noses are places where people are being radicalized? But she's working on these issues with very little money. We have a Tunisian woman. Tunisia is one of the biggest places where we have the foreign fighters going. Young woman in Tunisia who's now setting up an organization to work on arts, theater, and sports as an alternative. So these are people on the ground who are really coming up with ideas and solutions and a commitment, and they don't have an exit strategy. The rest of us, international community, all of us, have an exit strategy. If things get bad, we pull out. Local people don't, and that's why they need to be given the resources. Now, so that's the first thing. And one of the things that I really find interesting when I talk to my often UN colleagues about this question of broader inclusion is that, they kind of occasionally are slightly patronizing about, yes, ideally, of course, that would be great. But actually, I think this is a very pragmatic approach, because I think what's really idealistic these days is to think that any war that we're looking at can be ended by bringing two parties to the table and assuming that they represent the voices of people and they actually care what's going on. The space out there, the conflicts that we're looking at are so complicated that the two-party notion has disappeared, and yet we continue to go down that path. The second P is pressing. The problems we're dealing with are really beyond urgent. I mean, if you think about the refugee flows into Europe from Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, and so forth, last year was some, this year was more. It's going to get more and more. So long as these wars are there, these problems are going to exist. And one of the things we have to recognize is that the other side, if we're talking about any of these militias or extremist groups in all of these places, they recognize the value of women. Okay, so either they're recruiting them and indoctrinating them to spread the message, and they're doing it in very effective ways. Or they're killing the ones who stand up and speak out against them. Or they're also giving them education and then giving them economic empowerment so that they can stand on their own feet. So they're taking the agenda that we talk about and doing it for their own benefits. Right? So they understand the value and the power of women and doing it while we talk about it and we're not really doing it. This is something to bear in mind. So it's pressing because, as I said, if we don't fill that vacuum, they are, and they're being very effective. And then finally, it's possible. The most incredible thing that we have in front of us is that we have endless good examples of what can be done. If you look at what Norway has been doing in Colombia over the last few years as mediator of the Colombian conflict, 60 years of war. Norway has been there. They have brought a gendered lens into the discussions around land and victims and so forth. They've had gender advisors. They've enabled the space for civil society to be there. And guess what? The combination of having an inclusive process, generating the political will for the process to continue, is making it successful so far. Fingers crossed, let's hope it continues and so forth. But it's really important to look at the model and all the different components that are there. And one of the most important elements was that at some point they had delegations of people who'd been victimized by the different forces come to the peace talks and talk to the negotiators. And it gave the human face of war. This is something that we should be acknowledging. Civil society, and women especially, bring the human face of war into the political processes. And unless you have that emotional aspect, everything just, we can't just do it with our brains. The heart has to be there. The second place where it's been possible is Tunisia. We just heard that the Tunisian national dialogue process, stopping Tunisia going towards war and pulling it back into a more democratic space, was because of the engagement of civil society and especially of women. I can give you many, many other examples of places where this has been happening, but these are the two that happened that this year we're seeing. So it's there, the ideas are there. So finally, what is it that we need to do? Number one, we need a paradigm shift. Okay, so from exclusive processes to inclusive processes, because the nature of the conflict has become highly proliferated. It's almost like a democracy of violence out there. How can you take a complex set of issues and then say, okay, we're going to end it with a couple of guys sitting in a smoke-filled room? The second is, we have to think about it in terms of the paradigm shift example, is we need to go from the notion of power sharing to responsibility sharing. I was involved with the UN in the Somalia process, and it was during a famine. And they were talking about who's going to be president and who's going to be finance minister and all these kinds of things. And I was sitting there thinking, okay, you want to be finance minister? What's your responsibility from dealing with the famine? Right? From an international community perspective, let's talk about responsibility sharing and frame it as that. The third issue is that going from talking about peace processes as a political process to a societal process. This is really, really important. We cannot. I work with a Colombian woman, and this is one of the things she says is we need to question how we make peace. Talks to end fighting are not the same as what's needed to enable peace, right? So it's this idea that you have those actors there, but you have to think about society as a whole because the conflict has affected society as a whole. And then, as I said, the political will and inclusivity element. The second area that we need to talk about is busting the myths and the assumptions that have enabled this exclusivity. The first one is culture. So often we're told, oh, women are excluded from these processes because it's the culture of the country, right? But guess what? If it was cultural, then it would be different in Colombia than what it is in Nepal, than what it is in Uganda. And it's not. It's the same everywhere because actually it's about power. And power means trying to keep something to yourself as opposed to allowing others in to hold you accountable. So the culture argument is kind of nonsense. The second thing is that we talk about the parties. And again, I keep saying this. If we think of parties as only conflict parties, as opposed to peace parties and peace actors, conflict actors, we have to talk about peace actors as well. They are acting and they have a presence. And both of these sets of people are necessary but insufficient. You can't just have a peace process bringing in your civil society on their own, because they're not the ones who are creating the war. But we also can't have a peace process that's sustainable by just having the conflict parties. The research is now proving this over and over again. The other things that we often hear is that, women aren't relevant to these issues. We're talking about security and so forth, and who are these women anyway? And what I often say to people is that actually, at the moment, the criteria to enter is if you have guns, you get to come. So we have to change the criteria, and we produce a better peace tool, and a lot of this information is in there. So I'm going to end because I've been told to cut it. But here's what I want to end with. That Einstein also said that imagination is more important than knowledge. Okay, so we have a lot of knowledge about stuff, but we have to imagine an alternative future. And at the moment, women on the ground in conflict areas everywhere have that image, have that imagination, have that vision. All we need to do is to take their lead and listen to them and bring them into the spaces that we're dealing with. They have so many of the answers, and we just need to, if we believe in he for she, if we believe in equality, it's really about fundamentally respecting the voices of people on the ground who are at the front lines of all of this work. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.